The night I lost my job, my father started packing my things into garbage bags. "Your sister needs this space more than you do," he announced, without even looking at me. My sister stood screaming about who was going to pay her luxury car lease now that my paycheck was gone. My mother simply nodded along, smoothing her perfect church dress. I stood there looking at the people I had supported for years and said absolutely nothing about the holding company in my name or the private oceanfront estate I had just purchased. Hours later, they would realize they had just violently evicted the only person keeping them all out of federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who mistook your kindness for weakness. The betrayal began exactly at 5 in the afternoon on a rainy Tuesday. I was 33 years old and the top crisis management executive at a corporate firm. I had spent the last 7 years fixing disasters for billionaires and politicians, working 80-hour weeks to secure my position. My office phone rang, and my boss Sterling summoned me to the main conference room. When I walked in, he was not alone. Two human resources representatives sat frozen at the mahogany table, looking everywhere except at me. Sterling handed me a single sheet of paper. He claimed it was a corporate restructuring effort, and my position was being eliminated effective immediately. I stared at the termination letter in complete shock. I had just closed our largest account, bringing in millions in revenue. I demanded an explanation, but Sterling leaned back in his leather chair and offered a condescending smirk. "You can handle this, Maya," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You strong women always know how to carry the heavy loads. Besides, your father and I played golf last weekend. Marcus agreed that you needed a break from your exhausting schedule and that little internet hobby you spend so much time on." My blood ran completely cold. My father had orchestrated my termination. He had discussed my livelihood over 18 holes of golf and convinced my boss to cut my primary source of income. They thought my digital marketing agency was just a hobby, a cute side project that distracted me from my real purpose, serving my family. I did not give Sterling the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I packed my personal belongings into a single cardboard box, walked past my colleagues, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive to the suburbs felt like navigating through thick fog. Rain lashed against my windshield as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of my father crossing such an unforgivable line. The house I was driving to was a sprawling brick suburban estate that I paid the mortgage for every single month. When I graduated college, I had the income to afford the monthly payments, but not the credit history to secure the loan on my own. My parents had co-signed the mortgage and put their names on the deed, masking their control as a parental favor. For years, they held that technicality over my head, using it to dictate my life while I drained my accounts to keep a roof over their heads. I pulled into the wide driveway, taking a deep breath before grabbing my box of office supplies. I prepared myself for a conversation, expecting to demand answers from my father about his talk with Sterling. Instead, I opened the heavy oak front door and walked right into a living nightmare. My designer suitcases were haphazardly thrown across the entryway floor. Some were unzipped, with my clothes spilling out onto the polished hardwood. Marcus stood on a step stool in the hallway, methodically unscrewing the frame of my master's degree from the wall. He did not even pause his task when the front door clicked shut behind me. "You are home early," he noted casually, stepping down and placing my framed degree face down on the hallway console. "Good. It gives you more time to pack the rest of your items before dinner." I dropped my cardboard box onto the floor, the sound echoing through the high ceilings. "What is going on here?" I demanded, looking from my luggage to his impassive face. My mother Diane walked out of the formal dining room holding a cup of herbal tea. She wore her immaculate pastel suit, looking as though she were preparing for a Sunday church service rather than kicking her daughter out. "We are making some necessary adjustments, Maya," she said, taking a delicate sip of her tea. "Your sister is expanding her family, and they need a proper living space." It is time for you to find your own way. You cannot be serious, I said, my voice rising in disbelief. I pay the mortgage on this house. I pay the property taxes. I pay for the utilities that keep your tea hot. My father stepped forward, crossing his arms over his chest. Your name is not on the deed, Maya. Legally, this is our property and you need to leave. A mocking clap echoed from the top of the wooden staircase. I looked up to see Brad, my white brother-in-law, slowly descending the steps. Brad worked in finance and carried himself with an arrogance my parents absolutely adored. He reached the bottom step, blocking my path to the second floor, and offered a sickeningly smug grin. He raised his right hand and dangled my silver house keys right in front of my face. Thanks for keeping this place clean for us, Maya, he sneered, dropping the keys into his pocket. Chloe is pregnant now and we really need the master bedroom. Chloe stepped from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She wore a maternity dress that cost more than my car. She rubbed her belly with an exaggerated sigh, leaning against the wall, as if simply existing was a burden. She did not even look at my bags scattered across the floor. Brad is right, Maya, Chloe said, her voice dripping with syrupy entitlement. The doctor said I need absolute peace and quiet for the baby. Your master bedroom has the best morning light and the ensuite bathroom is safer for me. You can take the basement room. It is perfectly fine for a single woman. I stared at my younger sister. This was the same girl who dropped out of Spelman College 3 years ago because the coursework was demanding. My parents framed her academic failure as a courageous pivot to finding her calling. Since then, her calling consisted of living rent-free in my house and marrying Brad, a man whose arrogance was matched by his lack of accomplishments. The basement room, I repeated. You want to put me in the basement of the house I pay for so you can take my master suite. Brad chuckled, tossing my keys up in the air. Do not make a scene, Maya. We are family. We have to look out for the next generation. Marcus and Diane already agreed. I looked at my father, who was deliberately avoiding my gaze by inspecting a scuff mark on the wall. My mother adjusted her necklace, refusing to intervene. Their audacity pushed me to play the card I had dreaded all afternoon. I cannot pay for the house anymore, I said, letting the words hang in the air of the entryway. Sterling fired me 2 hours ago. My position was eliminated. I have no income. I expected silence. I expected a gasp. I perhaps naively expected my mother to rush forward and offer a comforting hug. Instead, Chloe let out a piercing shriek that echoed off the high ceilings. You lost your job, Chloe screamed, stepping away from the wall, her hands dropping from her belly. Are you out of your mind, Maya? Who is going to pay the lease on my Mercedes now? The payment is due on Friday. The absurdity of her reaction almost made me laugh. I just told you I lost my entire livelihood and your first thought is your luxury car. You promised, Chloe yelled, her face flushing with anger. You promised you would help me out until Brad got his big promotion. You know how important image is for his career. If they repossess my car, his partners will see it. You are ruining everything. My mother finally stepped forward, placing a protective arm around Chloe's shoulders. She glared at me with absolute disgust. Your sister is pregnant, Maya. She cannot handle this kind of stress right now. How could you be so utterly selfish? Selfish, I asked, stepping toward my mother. I have paid every bill in this house for 5 years. I paid for the caterer at Chloe's wedding when Brad's credit cards mysteriously declined. I paid your church tithes so you could maintain your status as the head of the women's ministry. And now that I have nothing, you call me selfish. Do not raise your voice to your mother, Marcus barked, finally stepping into the fray. You women are supposed to be strong. You are supposed to hold the family together. Instead, you come crying to us because you could not handle corporate politics. You always were too rigid, Maya. That is why you are 33 and completely alone. Diane shook her head, looking at me as if I were a stranger she had found trespassing in her home. We have an image to maintain in this community. What will the congregation say when they hear my eldest daughter was fired? It is humiliating. You need to find a new job by Monday. Until then, you cannot stay here. Your negative energy is bad for the baby. You are kicking me out, I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. You are kicking me out of my own home on the day I lost my job. It is not your home, Marcus stated, stepping right up to my face, his jaw set in a hard line. Our names are on the deed. We did you a favor co-signing for you when you were just a naive college graduate. This is our property. We decide who lives here, and right now Chloe needs the space. Pack whatever is left in those bags and get out. I looked at the four of them. My father, who used my career as a bragging right, but despised my independence. My mother, who valued her church reputation over her daughter. My sister, who viewed me as a personal bank. And Brad grinning beside them. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me. They wanted to claim the house based on a technicality. They wanted to discard me because they thought my money had dried up. They had no idea about the digital empire I had built in secret or the multi-million-dollar oceanfront estate waiting for me. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my purse, pulled out the spare garage key, and tossed it directly at Brad's chest. He fumbled to catch it, his smug smile faltering. I calmly bent down and grabbed the handles of my two nearest suitcases. Enjoy the house, I said, my voice perfectly steady. I turned around and walked out into the rain, letting the heavy oak door slam shut behind me, leaving them in the home I paid for. I did not look back. I simply walked toward my car, knowing my real life was waiting for me. The storm washed away the last traces of guilt. My future was bright, and it belonged entirely to me. Always. I merged onto the interstate, leaving the manicured lawns of my childhood behind forever. The rain pounded violently against my windshield, but my mind remained absolutely crystal clear. My parents probably thought I would be crying in some cheap roadside motel right now, desperately searching the internet for a new corporate master to serve. They assumed losing my crisis management position meant losing my entire identity and my only source of income. They were severely mistaken. I bypassed all the exits for cheap motels and drove straight toward the ferry terminal. 2 hours later, I drove my car off the ferry and onto the quiet, rain-slicked roads of Martha's Vineyard. I navigated the familiar winding route toward Oak Bluffs, a highly exclusive historic enclave where my parents could never even dream of affording property. I pulled up to the private wrought iron gates of a stunning $4 million oceanfront estate. The massive property was completely hidden behind tall privacy hedges, offering an uninterrupted sweeping view of the Atlantic Ocean. I rolled down my window and pressed my thumb against the glowing biometric scanner on the security pedestal. A soft chime sounded instantly, and the heavy metal gates swung open smoothly. I parked in the spacious heated garage and carried my two suitcases inside the house. The interior was a masterpiece of modern coastal design, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, vaulted ceilings, and expensive custom furniture. This was my hidden sanctuary. I had purchased it 2 years ago, entirely in cash through an anonymous trust. My family believed I spent my weekends attending tedious networking seminars in the city. In reality, I spent my weekends here watching the waves crash against the shore and quietly building my empire. I bypassed the expansive master suite upstairs and walked straight down the hall into my home office. I set my wet bags down on the floor and opened my laptop on the glass desk. The bright glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. I quickly logged into my highly secured private server. My father and my former boss, Sterling, thought they had completely destroyed my livelihood by firing me from the crisis management firm. They had merely freed up 40 hours of my week. I pulled up the main dashboard of my digital holding company. What my father constantly dismissed as a little internet hobby was actually a massive conglomerate of marketing agencies, e-commerce brands, and data analytics firms. I started the very first company in my college dorm room and quietly acquired several others over the past decade. I scrolled through the daily revenue reports. The green numbers flashing rapidly on the screen represented more money generated in a single month than my father made in 3 years as a regional manager. I had kept my corporate job simply as a convenient cover story to avoid my family's endless financial demands. If Marcus and Diane knew I was a multimillionaire, they would have relentlessly demanded I fund their entire lavish lifestyle and subsidize Brad and Chloe forever. The corporate job was my shield against their greed. Getting fired was actually a blessing in disguise. I approved a pending 8-figure acquisition with a single click of my mouse. Sterling firing me was the final push I needed to take my holding company public next quarter. With my own business matters sorted, I moved on to personal administration. It was time to completely untangle myself from my toxic family once and for all. I navigated to my personal banking portal. For years, I had linked my primary accounts to my parents' accounts to facilitate the direct transfers for their mortgage, property taxes, and high utility bills. I was entirely sick and tired of being treated like their personal automated teller machine. I clicked on the Settings tab, preparing to remove their access and sever the financial link permanently. Before my finger could hit the delete button, my eyes caught a strange discrepancy on the main dashboard. The portal displayed an aggregated summary of all linked accounts, including my parents' joint checking and their primary retirement fund. I leaned closer to the monitor, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. Something was terribly wrong with the numbers. I clicked directly into their retirement account, expecting to see the comfortable nest egg my father always boasted about. He loved lecturing everyone about smart investments. The screen loaded slowly, and a bright red number stared back at me. The account was practically empty. I quickly pulled up the detailed transaction history to investigate further. My hands flew across the keyboard as I downloaded the past 12 months of bank statements. My father had not suffered a sudden stock market crash. The money had been systematically withdrawn in massive chunks. 50,000 here, 100,000 there. The withdrawals were not going toward normal living expenses or medical bills. They were direct wire transfers to external anonymous shell accounts. My parents were completely broke. They were drowning in a massive hidden deficit that they had desperately tried to conceal behind their perfect suburban facade and expensive church outfits. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, processing the shock of the discovery. This explained their sudden violent urgency to claim the house today. They were not just making room for Chloe and her new baby, they were bleeding cash rapidly and needed my property to secure new financial leverage. But where had all the money gone? My father was arrogant, but he was not reckless with his own comfort. He would never willingly jeopardize his retirement fund unless he was actively covering up something catastrophic. I opened a new tab and began running a deep background check on the one person who handled the family finances besides me. I input the routing numbers from their outgoing wire transfers. A progress bar crawled slowly across. Checking my linked family financial accounts to untangle myself, I noticed a massive hidden deficit in my parents' retirement fund. I stared at the blinking red deficit on my screen, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The progress bar finished loading the external routing numbers, providing the exact destination of my parents' vanished retirement savings. I recognized the receiving bank immediately. It was the same elite wealth management firm where my brother-in-law Brad supposedly worked as a senior portfolio manager. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard security protocols, using my digital agency backdoors. If my father thought I was just playing with computers, he was completely oblivious to the sophisticated forensic software I had developed for high-stakes corporate crisis management. I ran a deep trace on the account numbers, and the truth unspooled before my eyes in damning black and white text. The money had not been deposited into a secure investment fund or a high-yield savings account. It had been funneled directly into a massive corporate restitution account. I dug deeper, pulling up the legal filings attached to the routing number. The court documents were heavily sealed, but my custom software easily stripped away the redactions. I leaned close to the monitor, reading the shocking details of an aggressive internal audit. Brad was not a financial genius. He was a reckless thief. The audit documents detailed a highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme stretching back 3 years. Brad had systematically siphoned $1.5 million from his wealthiest clients. He used the stolen funds to finance the lavish lifestyle Chloe constantly flaunted on social media. The designer bags, the luxury car leases, the expensive tropical vacations were all paid for with stolen money. His firm had caught him 2 months ago. They offered him a quiet ultimatum. He could either repay the entire stolen amount immediately or face federal prosecution and public disgrace. Brad had panicked and gone crying to my parents. I felt a wave of absolute disgust wash over me as I pieced the timeline together. My parents had sacrificed everything to protect the golden child and her fraudulent husband. They were terrified of the scandal ruining their spotless reputation at our local church. Even worse, they were desperate to maintain their social standing with Brad's incredibly wealthy and elitist parents who constantly looked down on our family and judged our suburban lifestyle. I opened a new search query and accessed the municipal property records for the suburban house I had just been evicted from. My heart pounded against my ribs as the deed information loaded on the screen. My parents had not just drained their retirement accounts to save Brad from prison, they had secretly remortgaged the entire house, extracting every single dime of equity I had painstakingly built up over the past 5 years of paying their mortgage. They took out a predatory high-interest loan against the property to cover the remaining balance of Brad's massive theft. They legally bound the house to a ruthless private lending company, effectively gambling away the roof over their own heads. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped into place, forming a sickening picture of their betrayal. My father had not conspired to get me fired just because he wanted to control me. He orchestrated my termination because he knew I would eventually discover the second mortgage when the aggressive new loan terms kicked in next month. He needed me out of the house and financially ruined before I could uncover their massive criminal cover-up. He needed me broken silent and completely powerless to fight back. By having Sterling fire me, my father ensured I would lose my income and my ability to demand answers. He kicked me out under the guise of making room for Chloe and her baby, framing me as the selfish daughter who refused to support her family in a time of need. They planned to let the house go into foreclosure while blaming my sudden unemployment for the financial collapse. They were going to let me take the fall for their catastrophic mistakes while they quietly moved into Brad's parents' luxury guest house to maintain their wealthy facade without any personal consequences. I sat back in my leather chair, listening to the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the beach outside my window. The sheer magnitude of their manipulation was staggering. They had sacrificed my career, my financial stability, and my home just to keep a criminal out of jail. They had smiled in my face while secretly destroying everything I had worked so hard for. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was helpless. They assumed my digital agency was a joke. They never expected me to trace the stolen money back to its source. I cracked my knuckles, preparing to initiate the next phase of my strategy. I needed to protect my own digital assets and sever any remaining legal ties to their impending financial ruin before the lenders started looking for someone to sue. As I reached for my mouse, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of my desk. A bright notification flashed across the screen from a family location sharing application. Chloe had insisted we all download the tracking software 2 years ago, claiming it was for family safety. She used it constantly to monitor my movements and complain if I went to expensive restaurants without inviting her along to pay the bill. In her arrogant haste to kick me out of the house today, she had completely forgotten to disable her own location broadcasting. I tapped the notification, expanding the digital map on my screen. A small, blinking icon representing Chloe and Brad was moving rapidly down the interstate. I watched the icon trace a direct path away from the suburbs and straight toward the coastal ferry terminal at Woods Hole. My pulse quickened as the tracking software updated their final destination. They were boarding the evening ferry. They were speeding directly toward my new hidden oceanfront estate right now. The glowing icon blinked steadily, moving closer to the Oak Bluffs perimeter. I closed the financial forensic files and brought up the estate security camera feeds on my secondary monitor. Rain still pounded violently against the thick glass of my office windows. Within 10 minutes, the bright headlights of Chloe's leased Mercedes cut through the thick coastal fog, illuminating the massive wrought iron gates of my secluded property. I watched closely through the high-definition night vision lens as Brad rolled down his driver's side window. He leaned far out into the freezing pouring rain, looking frantically around the secluded manicured street, expecting to find a rundown apartment complex or a cheap seasonal motel. Instead, he was staring blankly at an imposing 10-foot-high stone privacy wall and a custom security gate that belonged to a highly exclusive $4 million fortress. Chloe leaned across the center leather console, her face illuminated by the bright dashboard lights. Her mouth moved rapidly, clearly complaining loudly about the address I had never actually given them. Brad pressed the intercom button violently, his soaked hair plastered to his forehead. "Maya, open this heavy gate right now!" Brad shouted, his voice crackling aggressively through the desktop speaker in my office. "We know you are hiding in there. The Family Tracker app says you are standing right here on this exact property. Open up this second before I call the local authorities and report a stolen vehicle." I pressed the communication button on my desk console, keeping my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of emotion. "You are driving the leased Mercedes, Brad. I am driving my own fully paid-off car. There is absolutely nothing to report." I watched his eyes widen dramatically on the surveillance monitor as my voice echoed loudly from the hidden speakers embedded deep in the stone pillars. Chloe suddenly snatched the driver's side window control away from him. "Maya, what exactly is this massive place?" she demanded, shrilly, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing coastal wind whipped heavy rain directly into the luxury sedan interior. "Did you break into someone's empty vacation house? Are you squatting? I told Dad you were having a complete mental breakdown after getting fired today. Open this gate right now before I freeze." Brad grabbed the steering wheel back aggressively. "Do not play these childish games with us, Maya. I work in high-level finance. I know exactly what is going on here. You deliberately siphoned money from your parents' monthly mortgage payments to secretly rent this luxury monstrosity. You stole from the family to fund a fake wealthy vacation because you could not handle the humiliation of losing your prestigious corporate job. I am coming in there to audit whatever digital files you have left." His immediate psychological projection was almost laughable. The man who had just maliciously embezzled $1.5 million from his wealthiest clients was accusing me of stealing my own hard-earned money to simply rent a house I legally owned outright. I glanced briefly at the secondary camera feed showing the quiet, exclusive private street. Two of my billionaire neighbors valued their absolute privacy above all else, and a screaming entitled pregnant woman in a leased car was exactly the kind of obnoxious neighborhood disturbance that immediately drew unwanted local police attention. I had spent 2 long years carefully building a spotless, quiet reputation in this upscale community. I was certainly not going to let Brad and Chloe drag my good name through the mud on my very first night living here full-time. I hit the gate release switch. The heavy iron gates swung inward with a silent, smooth sweeping motion. Brad instantly slammed on the gas pedal tires, screeching loudly on the wet pavement as he sped dangerously up the long, winding driveway lined with imported blooming hydrangea bushes. I walked slowly out of my office and stood perfectly still in the grand marble foyer, waiting for their chaotic entrance. The massive, solid double doors were shielded by a wide, protective stone portico. Brad did not even bother knocking. He threw the heavy front door open aggressively, marching right in, tracking thick, wet mud across my pristine, expensive floors. Chloe waddled in quickly right behind him, her jaw dropping completely open as she took in the sweeping, dual-curved staircase, the massive, sparkling crystal chandelier, and the entirely unobstructed, breathtaking view of the dark, churning ocean visible through the back glass walls. "This is easily a $20,000 a month premium summer rental," Brad barked loudly, pointing a shaking, accusing finger directly at my chest. "You are a disgusting parasite, Maya. Marcus and Diane are barely scraping by right now, and you are hiding out in a beachfront luxury mansion pretending to be rich. Where did you hide the rest of the stolen family money?" I crossed my arms tightly, standing my ground firmly on the imported Italian marble. "You really want to talk about hiding stolen family money tonight, Brad?" I asked, my tone slicing cleanly through the thick tension in the room. You want to accurately discuss who is barely scraping by and exactly why they are broke. I watched his chest puff out, largely preparing to launch into another loud, arrogant tirade meant to mask his own massive financial crimes. I was seconds away from dropping the printed forensic audit directly onto the foyer table and watching his entire fake successful life shatter into tiny pieces. Before I could say another word, the security perimeter alarm chimed softly and musically through the smart home system. A second vehicle had just breached the still open front gates. I turned my attention to the glowing security panel mounted on the foyer wall. My parents' silver Lexus SUV was speeding recklessly up the driveway. Marcus and Diane were not just checking on their golden child. The camera feed showed them eagerly unbuckling their seatbelts before the car even shifted fully into park. My mother stepped quickly out into the rain, carrying two massive shopping bags filled with expensive party supplies and premium champagne. My father pulled a thick stack of exclusive catering menus from the trunk. They had not come to evict me again. They had come to hijack my sanctuary. My mother pushed past me without a single word of greeting. She dropped her heavy shopping bags onto a custom Italian marble console table, scratching the surface with the sharp metal feet of her designer purse. Diane walked slowly into the grand living room, completely mesmerized by the sheer scale of the estate. She admired the soaring 20-foot ceilings and the priceless crystal chandelier hanging above the grand staircase. She traced her fingers along the rich mahogany trim of the custom-built fireplace, marveling at the craftsmanship. She noticed the expensive modern art hanging on the freshly painted, pristine white walls. She ran her hands over the imported velvet sofa and stared out the massive panoramic windows at the Atlantic Ocean. She did not ask how I managed to bypass the security gates. She did not ask if I owned the property. Her mind simply bypassed logic and went straight to entitlement. "This will do perfectly," Diane announced. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She turned to Marcus with a manic gleam in her eyes. "Bring the rest of the champagne from the trunk. We need to chill it immediately." "Excuse me," I said, stepping into the center of the room. "You are trespassing." Brad sneered, crossing his arms over his wet shirt. "Drop the act, Maya. We already know you are squatting here or using some corporate client account to hide out. It does not matter anyway. You owe us for the stress you caused the family today." Chloe waddled over to the velvet sofa and collapsed onto it with a heavy sigh. "Mom is right. This place is gorgeous. It is way better than that cramped suburban house anyway. The natural light in here is perfect for my maternity photos." Diane ignored my protest entirely. She clapped her hands together, turning her attention exclusively to Brad and Chloe. "Listen to me," Diane said, her voice trembling with a strange, frantic energy. "Brad's parents just called us from their private jet. They are flying in from Geneva tomorrow morning to celebrate the baby. They want to take us all out to an expensive dinner to discuss trust funds and family investments." Brad visibly paled at the mention of his parents. I watched his throat swallow hard. He was terrified. His elitist wealthy parents thought he was a highly successful portfolio manager. If they discovered he was actually a desperate criminal facing federal prosecution, they would cut him off entirely. "We cannot let them take us out," Marcus declared, marching into the living room with two more boxes of expensive catering supplies. "If we go to a restaurant, they will insist on paying, and they will expect us to match their level of wealth. We need to host them. We need to project absolute financial dominance." "Exactly," Diane agreed eagerly. "And our house is currently undergoing some sudden plumbing renovations. We cannot possibly host them there. But this estate is flawless. It projects exactly the right image. We will host the dinner party right here tomorrow night." They were spinning a desperate web of lies right in front of me. Their house was not undergoing plumbing renovations. It was leveraged to the absolute brink of foreclosure to cover Brad's massive embezzlement. "You are out of your minds," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You cannot host a dinner party for billionaires in a house that does not belong to you." Marcus stepped right up to my face. His jaw was set in that familiar hard line he used whenever he wanted to crush my spirit. We can and we will, Maya. You lost your job today. You brought shame on this family. The least you can do is let us use this property to secure your sister's future. Brad's parents are extremely particular. If they see us hosting them in a $4 million oceanfront estate, they will have no doubts about our financial standing. It is settled then, Chloe squealed, completely ignoring the tension. Brad and I will take the master suite upstairs. Mom and Dad can take the guest wing. What about her? Brad asked, pointing a disgusted finger at me. My parents cannot see her lounging around here. She is unemployed. She will completely ruin the wealthy aesthetic we are trying to project. Diane looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage that had washed up on the pristine beach outside. There is a small guest house near the garage, she noted, pointing out the window. I saw it when we pulled in. Maya can stay out of sight in there until the dinner is over. Marcus nodded firmly. That is not all. We spent our entire budget on the premium food and champagne. We could not afford to hire private staff on such short notice. Brad's parents are accustomed to being served by professionals. Marcus looked me up and down with absolute contempt. You are going to make yourself useful for once in your life, Maya. You will stay hidden in the guest house tonight. Tomorrow evening, you will put on a plain black uniform. You will stay in the kitchen, cook the food, and serve us the dinner. You want me to play the role of the hired help? I asked, letting the sheer audacity of his demand hang in the air. In this house. You are unemployed, Diane snapped impatiently. Consider it an internship in humility. You will serve the food, pour the wine, and remain completely silent. If Brad's parents ask you, simply say you are part of the estate staff. Do not dare mention you are related to us. They had no idea I held the financial forensics that could send Brad to federal prison and leave my parents entirely homeless. Tomorrow night provided the perfect stage for their absolute ruin. I looked at my father and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. All right, I said smoothly. I will serve the dinner tomorrow night as requested. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of frantic, chaotic energy as my family commandeered my home. I remained completely out of sight in the guest house just as my father commanded, using the quiet hours to finalize the digital traps I was laying for them. By 6 o'clock the following evening, the estate was transformed. Diane had hired a luxury florist who filled the grand foyer with towering arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas. The expensive catering company had dropped off the prepared food, leaving me to handle the final plating and serving. I stood in my own massive custom chef kitchen, tying the strings of a plain black apron around my waist. The coarse fabric felt rough against my expensive silk blouse, but it was the perfect costume for the role I was about to play. I watched closely through the thick glass pantry door as my parents frantically arranged the fine bone china on the long mahogany dining table. Marcus was sweating profusely, adjusting his silk tie every few seconds. Brad nervously paced the entire length of the oceanfront living room, downing his second glass of scotch before his parents even arrived. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. The security gate chime echoed through the smart home system, signaling the arrival of Arthur and Eleanor Sterling. Brad practically sprinted to the front doors, throwing them open with a sickeningly eager smile. Arthur Sterling stepped into the foyer, radiating the kind of arrogant generational wealth that demanded immediate submission from everyone in the room. Eleanor followed close behind him, her sharp, judgmental eyes immediately scanning the architecture and the imported furnishings. I could see the visible relief wash over my parents' faces when Eleanor offered a tight, approving nod. Diane immediately swooped in, offering to take their coats and offering a gushing tour of the property they were falsely claiming as their own. I loaded a silver tray with smoked salmon blinis and beluga caviar, pushing open the swinging kitchen door. I kept my head bowed and my expression entirely blank as I moved silently into the living room. My father shot me a harsh warning glare as I approached the seating area. I lowered the tray toward Arthur and Eleanor, offering the appetizers with the practiced deference of a hired servant. Arthur took a blini without even looking at my face, treating me like a piece of invisible furniture. Chloe, however, could not resist the opportunity to elevate her own status by publicly stepping on mine. She rested a hand on her pregnant belly and let out a soft, condescending laugh. Maya, be a dear, and fetch Eleanor a glass of the vintage champagne, Chloe commanded, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She turned to her mother-in-law with a conspiratorial smile. You remember my older sister Maya, do you not, Eleanor? She is just helping us out tonight to earn a little extra pocket money. She actually has plenty of experience carrying heavy trays for wealthy people. Eleanor raised an impeccably groomed eyebrow, sipping her sparkling water. Is that so? Oh, absolutely. Chloe continued, eager to humiliate me further. While our parents generously paid my entire tuition so I could focus properly on my sorority obligations and networking, Maya insisted on taking the difficult road. She waited tables at a cheap diner near campus all 4 years to pay her own way. She always did have a rather blue-collar mentality. It is why she struggles so much in the corporate world. She was actually just let go from her job yesterday. We took her in out of pity. My mother let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, rushing to smooth over the awkwardness. Yes, well, we believe in supporting family even when they make poor life choices. Maya, please go check on the main course. I offered a crisp, polite nod. Right away, Mom, I replied smoothly. I turned and walked back toward the dining room carrying the half-empty tray of appetizers. My face remained perfectly calm, but my mind was operating with lethal precision. I set the silver tray down on the sideboard and reached deep into the pocket of my black apron. I pulled out 3 tiny high-definition audio recording devices. They were smaller than a coin and completely undetectable. I had designed them myself for high-stakes corporate espionage cases. I moved methodically around the massive mahogany dining table, pretending to adjust the silver cutlery and the crystal wine glasses. I slid the first recording device underneath the center of the table, pressing the adhesive backing firmly against the wood directly where Arthur Sterling would be sitting. I walked toward the fireplace and tucked the second device behind a heavy marble clock, ensuring it would capture every single word spoken in the lounge area. I placed the third and final device inside a towering floral arrangement near my father's assigned seat. I was not just going to expose Brad's massive embezzlement. I was going to record my parents actively participating in the cover-up and present the unedited audio files directly to the federal authorities. They wanted me to be the invisible help. They were about to learn that the help hears absolutely everything. I retreated into the quiet sanctuary of the butler's pantry, letting the heavy swinging door close securely behind me. I untied the black apron and let it drop to the floor. I pulled my highly encrypted secondary mobile device from my pocket. The screen was already lit up with a barrage of urgent notifications. I ignored the messages from my former colleagues and tapped directly into my holding company's secure executive portal. I held my breath as the final confirmation screen loaded. The aggressive hostile takeover I had initiated weeks ago had just been finalized. My massive digital conglomerate now officially owned Sterling Global Investments and all its assets. I was now Arthur and Brad's absolute ultimate boss. I locked the phone screen and slipped the device back into my apron pocket. A cold surge of absolute adrenaline coursed through my veins. I was no longer just the scapegoat sister or the discarded daughter. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I smoothed down the rough fabric of my uniform and pushed the swinging pantry door open. The dining room was bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandelier, but the atmosphere was thick with suffocating tension. I approached the table silently, carrying a silver pitcher of ice water. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling were seated at the head of the table, examining the imported linen napkins with thinly veiled disdain. Eleanor ran her perfectly manicured fingernail along the edge of her plate and let out a soft, condescending sigh. "It is a charming little starter home, Diane," she murmured, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "We considered buying on this side of the island once, but Arthur felt the neighborhood was simply too densely populated. We prefer the absolute privacy of our compound in Geneva." My mother immediately leaned forward, practically vibrating with desperate submission. "Oh, we completely agree," Eleanor Diane gushed, pouring another generous measure of vintage champagne into the older woman's glass. "We are actually looking to upgrade very soon. This estate was just a quick impulse purchase to have a place by the water. Marcus and I prefer massive acreage too. We value exclusivity above all else. We are just so thrilled you could fly out to celebrate the baby with us tonight. Marcus nodded vigorously. Absolutely, Arthur, he chimed in, his voice pitched artificially low to sound authoritative. We view this house as a temporary investment vehicle. The local market is adequate, but we are eyeing a private peninsula further north for our permanent summer residence. I poured water into Arthur's glass, keeping my expression entirely blank, as my father shamelessly lied about purchasing a house he did not even own. They were twisting themselves into pathetic knots to impress a man I now legally owned. Arthur ignored my father entirely. He took a sip of the champagne and frowned slightly, examining the label on the bottle. It is an acceptable vintage, he stated, flatly, turning his attention to his son. So, Brad, tell me about this massive upcoming promotion you mentioned on the phone. You said the board is preparing to name you Senior Managing Director by the end of the fiscal quarter. That is a significant leap for someone your age. I expect you are handling the offshore portfolio expansion we discussed last month. Brad puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie with sweaty, trembling fingers. I watched the pulse pounding rapidly in his neck as he prepared to spin his desperate web of lies. Yes, Father Brad boasted. The partners are incredibly impressed with my asset allocation strategy. I have completely reorganized the offshore accounts and generated unprecedented returns for our top-tier clients. The Senior Managing Director title is essentially guaranteed at this point. They recognize my value to the firm. They cannot afford to lose my financial expertise. Chloe beamed, patting her pregnant belly with a smug, satisfied smile. Brad works so incredibly hard, Eleanor, she chimed in. He is practically running the entire division single-handedly. We are already looking at private preschools for the baby because we know Brad's new salary will cover the best education money can buy. She shot a nasty pointed glare in my direction as I collected the empty appetizer plates. Some people simply lack the drive to succeed in the real world. I stacked the fine china onto my tray, maintaining my silence. Brad was not running the division. He was frantically moving embezzled funds between shadow accounts to cover massive market losses. The unprecedented returns he bragged about were fabricated. The digital traps I set had already captured every fraudulent transaction he executed over the past 2 years. His impending promotion was actually an impending federal indictment. I retreated toward the kitchen doors, listening intently as the recording devices captured every self-incriminating word spoken in that dining room. I stepped back into the butler's pantry and set the heavy tray down on the granite counter. The encrypted audio fed directly into my secure earpiece, providing crystal-clear sound from the dining room. I heard the scrape of a chair as Arthur Sterling stood up holding his crystal champagne flute. My parents immediately fell into a reverent, silent hush, hanging on his every word. Arthur cleared his throat, commanding absolute attention from the desperate sycophants seated around him. Well, Brad, Arthur began, his voice echoing through the hidden microphone. If you are truly about to be named Senior Managing Director, we must ensure you are properly aligned with the top executives. Networking is the absolute lifeblood of our industry. You must surround yourself with ruthless, successful individuals who understand how to execute difficult decisions without hesitation. That is why I took the liberty of inviting a very special VIP guest to join us for dinner tonight. He will be arriving here shortly. I paused, gripping the edge of the granite counter. A VIP guest was not part of my original calculation. I listened closely as Diane let out a breathless, excited gasp. Oh, Arthur, what a wonderful surprise, she cooed. We are always thrilled to host important connections. Who exactly is joining us tonight? We need to ensure the chef prepares an extra plate immediately. Arthur chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that chilled the entire dining room. I invited the man who just executed the most ruthless departmental purge our firm has ever seen, Arthur announced proudly. He is a brilliant corporate strategist, and he specifically handled the termination of the dead weight in the marketing division yesterday. He is the cruel boss who personally fired your lovely catering assistant, Maya. He wanted to celebrate the corporate restructuring, and I knew you would all love to meet him tonight. The heavy silence following Arthur's announcement was absolute. I stood frozen in the butler's pantry processing the absurdity. Arthur invited the former CEO of my holding company to dinner. The man had not fired me. I fired him. I liquidated his board after exposing his gross financial mismanagement. Arthur was bringing a disgraced executive into my house believing he was a conquering titan. My parents had no idea. Brad had no idea. The irony was suffocating. Through the hidden earpiece, I heard my mother choke on her champagne. Her voice pitched upward into a panicked register. "Oh, Arthur, that is certainly an unexpected development," Diane stammered, trying to maintain her wealthy hostess facade. "We would be absolutely delighted to host him. Marcus, please fetch the reserve bottles of Bordeaux from the cellar. We must ensure our guest receives the highest level of hospitality. I need to briefly check the kitchen staff to ensure flawless pacing. Excuse me for one moment." The heavy swinging door burst open before I could take a step back. Diane stormed into the room, her face flushed a blotchy, angry red beneath her expensive foundation. Her eyes darted around the stainless steel countertops before locking onto me. She crossed the room in 3 rapid strides and grabbed my upper arm. Her manicured nails dug viciously into my skin through the thin fabric of the black apron. She dragged me away from the door toward the commercial refrigerator, ensuring our voices would not carry. "Are you completely insane?" Diane violently whispered, her face inches from mine. "Did you hear what Arthur just said out there? The man who fired you is walking through those doors any minute. If he recognizes you serving appetizers, our entire reputation is permanently destroyed. Brad's parents will realize you are our daughter, and they will know we are connected to a corporate failure." I gently removed her clawing hand from my arm. "I am simply serving the food as you demanded, Diane. I am doing exactly what I was told to do." Diane bared her teeth, leaning closer. Her breath smelled of expensive champagne and blind panic. "You need to serve the premium wine faster," she hissed aggressively, pointing at the row of vintage bottles resting on the granite island. "You need to pour the drinks, keep everyone completely intoxicated, and stay in the shadows. Keep your head down. Do not look him in the eye when he arrives. You are already a massive embarrassment to this family, Maya. Do not drag your sister down with your complete lack of ambition." I turned my back and picked up a heavy silver corkscrew. I drove the metal spiral cleanly into the cork of a $3,000 bottle. "You seem very concerned about social appearances tonight," I noted, my voice chillingly calm and devoid of emotion. Diane scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Of course I am concerned. Chloe is about to marry into a prominent billionaire family. She understands how to navigate elite social circles. You have always been a complete social liability. Even as a teenager, you refused to network at the country club. You never understood that perception is reality. You will never be as socially acceptable as Chloe. You proved that yesterday when you lost your corporate job and came crawling to this estate to hide." The cork popped from the bottle with a sharp, satisfying sound. I reached for the polished crystal decanter and began pouring the rich red liquid in a slow, steady stream. Diane paced frantically the length of the kitchen island. "You always had to do things the hard way," Diane muttered. "You worked those miserable restaurant shifts to pay your tuition because you wanted to prove some ridiculous point about independence. Look exactly where that little blue-collar mentality got you, Maya. You are broke and serving food to your successful sister and her wealthy in-laws. This is exactly why we invested all our energy into Chloe and Brad. They understand how wealth operates in the real world. They project power." I placed the heavy glass decanter onto a polished silver serving tray, arranging 6 crystal wine glasses around it with meticulous precision. "They certainly project a very specific kind of power." I agreed smoothly, wiping a non-existent smudge from the tray. "I wonder how Arthur Sterling will react when he discovers just how powerful Brad truly is behind closed doors." Diane stopped pacing and glared at me, her eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Out there," she snapped, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. "You are the help tonight, Maya. act like it. Serve the wine, clear the plates, and remain completely invisible. If you ruin this dinner party, I will personally ensure you never set foot in our home again." She turned on her designer heel and marched back toward the swinging door, smoothing her hair and instantly plastering a bright, fake smile back onto her face before re-entering the dining room. I watched the heavy door swing shut behind her, plunging the kitchen back into silence. The digital recorder hidden in my apron pocket had captured every vicious insult and every frantic admission of her shallow social climbing. I stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen, listening to the overlapping conversations feeding through my earpiece. The trap was fully set. The actors were perfectly positioned on the stage. My parents and Brad were desperately clinging to a manufactured reality about to shatter into irreparable pieces. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted mobile device. I opened my secure messaging application and selected the contact thread for my elite corporate legal team. I stared at the glowing screen for a brief moment, feeling absolute closure. The years of being the family scapegoat, the relentless comparisons to Chloe, the quiet dismissal of my hard work, it was ending tonight. I typed a single sentence into the text field. Initiate phase 2. I slid the phone back into my pocket and smoothed my hands down the coarse fabric of the apron. The heavy crystal decanter rested perfectly in the center of the polished silver tray, surrounded by the gleaming wine glasses. I lifted the tray, balancing the weight with practiced ease, and pushed my way back through the swinging kitchen doors. The atmosphere in the living room had shifted from anxious anticipation to electric excitement. The heavy mahogany front doors were already wide open, and Marcus was bowing his head with sickening subservience. Arthur stood proudly beside the entryway, waiting to welcome his prized corporate titan. The man who walked through the door possessed a chillingly familiar swagger. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed unearned wealth and carried himself with the bloated confidence of a man who destroyed lives for sport. It was Victor Sterling, the executive, who fired me. He was the man who had stolen my marketing campaigns, taken credit for my massive financial acquisitions, and ultimately fired me to cover his own corporate fraud. Arthur clapped Victor on the shoulder with a booming laugh, leading him directly into the formal dining room. Brad scrambled behind them, practically tripping over his own expensive leather shoes to pull out a chair for the new arrival. Chloe sat up perfectly straight, fluffing her hair. Diane hovered nervously near the doorway, her eyes darting between the kitchen and the billionaires invading the house she did not own. I approached the long dining table, my footsteps entirely silent against the imported Persian rug. I kept my gaze leveled at the crystal glasses, setting the heavy silver tray onto the sideboard. The dining room was buzzing with self-congratulatory praise. "We are absolutely thrilled you could join us, Victor," Arthur declared, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Brad has been telling us how brilliantly you handled the corporate restructuring yesterday. Trimming the excess fat from the company is exactly what the board needed to see." Victor let out a loud, arrogant bark of laughter, unbuttoning his suit jacket as he settled into the plush dining chair. "It had to be done, Arthur. We had too many directors who thought they were irreplaceable. I severed her access and had security march her straight to the parking garage." Brad nodded aggressively, leaning forward. "Absolute power move, sir. You have to assert dominance over the subordinates. It is the only language they truly respect." I picked up the heavy crystal decanter, letting the rich red wine swirl gently against the glass. I stepped up directly behind Victor Sterling, positioning myself at his right shoulder. I leaned forward slightly and began to pour the expensive vintage into his glass. Victor turned his head to offer a dismissive word to the hired help. His eyes traveled up my arm and locked directly onto my face. The smug, arrogant grin froze instantly on his features. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pale gray. His jaw dropped open. He blinked rapidly as if his brain was failing to process the visual information. For a fraction of a second, genuine panic flashed in his eyes. Then his arrogant corporate survival instincts kicked in. He assumed I had completely hit rock bottom. He assumed my presence here in a black apron was the ultimate symbol of my total defeat. Victor threw his head back and burst into a booming theatrical fit of laughter. The sound bounced violently off the vaulted ceilings, echoing through the entire estate. He slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, rattling the fine bone china. "Well, look at this!" Victor shouted, pointing a highly manicured finger directly at my face. "I do not believe it. My former marketing director is standing here pouring my wine." The entire table froze. Arthur frowned, looking confusedly between Victor and me. Diane let out a sharp, strangled gasp, gripping the edge of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Brad stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing the careful illusion of his perfect family was rapidly disintegrating. Victor wiped a tear of cruel amusement from his eye. "Marcus, you really put her in her place," Victor mocked, turning to my father with a delighted sneer. "You actually have her serving the appetizers. I fired her yesterday for gross incompetence, and today she is wearing a maid uniform and fetching my drinks. This is absolutely priceless. I should take a photograph for the corporate newsletter." Chloe immediately seized the opportunity to align herself with the most powerful man in the room. She let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh, pointing her diamond-adorned finger at me. "I told you she had a blue-collar mentality," Chloe gloated to the table. "She has absolutely zero ambition. She is practically begging to be the hired help. It is exactly where she belongs." Brad let out a nervous, shaky chuckle, desperate to stay in Victor's good graces. "We try to teach her about success, sir, but some people are just natural failures." The table erupted into cruel, unified laughter. Arthur chuckled, sipping his water. Eleanor offered a tight, amused smile, clearly entertained by my public degradation. My parents remained entirely silent, paralyzed by the fear that their web of lies was about to be exposed, but far too cowardly to defend their own daughter against a billionaire. They laughed, they mocked, they reveled in my manufactured humiliation. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Victor Sterling. I remained chillingly calm, letting the heavy silence of my own composure contrast sharply against their frantic, desperate noise. I slowly tilted the crystal decanter backward, cutting off the flow of wine without spilling a single drop. I set the heavy glass vessel back onto the silver tray with a sharp, definitive click. I reached behind my waist and gripped the tight strings of the black apron. I pulled the knot free with a swift, fluid motion. I pulled the coarse fabric over my head, holding the apron in my right hand. The room slowly fell silent as the guests registered my absolute lack of submission. The laughter died in their throats. I looked down at Victor Sterling. I dropped the crumpled black apron directly onto his pristine white dinner plate right over his expensive catering. Before anyone could utter a single word of outrage, I turned around and walked calmly toward the kitchen island. I reached for the thick manila envelope next to the sink. I pulled out a pristine, heavily bound legal dossier. It contained the complete forensic documentation of Brad's massive embezzlement, the hostile takeover contracts, and the termination papers for every executive sitting at that table. The weight of the documents felt deeply satisfying in my grasp. This was not just a simple collection of financial records. It was a loaded weapon aimed directly at their entire existence. I walked purposefully back toward the dining room, carrying the undeniable proof of their impending ruin. My footsteps were steady and measured. The soft rustle of my silk blouse replaced the coarse scrape of the apron. The horrified expressions on their faces told me they finally realized the game had changed entirely. They were no longer dealing with the family scapegoat or the disgraced employee. They were staring directly at their absolute destruction. I stepped into the dining room. The heavy silence hung thick and suffocating. Victor Sterling opened his mouth to bark another insult. He expected me to return with a fresh apron and a desperate apology. Instead, I approached the head of the table holding the thick legal dossier. I ignored my parents and sister. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Victor. He scoffed, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. "What is this?" Maya Victor demanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "A resume. Are you begging for a recommendation letter after your disastrous performance? I told your father I would handle your termination quietly, but you are making that incredibly difficult." I stopped directly next to his plush dining chair. "I am not pouring your wine," I stated, my voice echoing clearly off the dining room walls. I am taking inventory of my assets. I raised the heavy dossier and dropped it flat onto the polished mahogany dining table. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The fine china rattled. A few drops of red wine spilled from Victor glass, staining the imported linen tablecloth. Diane gasped, pressing her trembling hand tightly over her mouth. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly refusing to meet my gaze. Brad stared at the thick stack of papers as if it were a live explosive. Victor stared at the dossier and let out a sharp, nervous laugh. He glanced around the table, seeking validation for his arrogance, but found only frozen terror. "What is this absolute garbage?" Victor sneered, tapping the cover with his manicured fingernail. "Some desperate, wrongful termination lawsuit. You have absolutely no grounds, Maya. You are fired for cause. Your marketing strategies were actively losing us money." I leaned forward, placing both my hands flat on the table. "My marketing strategies generated unprecedented revenue, Victor. Your offshore shell accounts were losing money. The same shadow accounts you and Brad used to hide the firm's massive quarterly deficits." I watched Brad physically recoil in his chair, his face rapidly turning the sickening color of wet ash. Victor narrowed his eyes, his arrogant smile finally dropping completely. He leaned back, attempting to project authority. "You are entirely delusional, Maya. You have zero proof of any financial irregularities. Furthermore, you do not have the resources to litigate against a corporate giant. My legal team will bury you in paperwork until you are bankrupt." I slowly reached forward and flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. "I am not suing you, Victor. I am acquiring you. Actually, I already acquired you. The transaction finalized 45 minutes ago." I slid the top document across the polished wood directly into his line of sight. Victor frowned, looking down at the crisp white paper. It was the finalized acquisition contract. His eyes scanned the bold black text, reading the clauses and the signatures. He scoffed, shaking his head dismissively. "This is a complete fabrication. We were acquired by an anonymous international holding company. The board voted on it this morning. We were swallowed by Apex Global Consortium. They are a massive entity. You have absolutely no connection to them." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "I am Apex Global Consortium. I established the holding company 3 years ago, using the initial capital I earned from the software patents I developed in college. I built it quietly, moving assets through international channels while you all thought I was struggling to pay rent. I swallowed your entire firm, Victor. I own the majority shares. I own the debt. I own the intellectual property. And as of 45 minutes ago, I own your employment contract." The blood drained from Victor's face. He picked up the document, his hands suddenly trembling. He flipped to the second page, staring at the undeniable proof of my ownership. The official corporate seals, the verified financial transfers, the binding legal signatures. It was all there. His entire professional empire now belonged to the woman he had treated like an annoying pest. Marcus slammed his hand onto the table. His face was purple with outrage. "This is impossible," Marcus shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You do not have that kind of money. You are a waitress. You are a failure. I specifically asked Victor to fire you so you would finally learn a lesson about respect and come crawling back to the family business." The admission hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Chloe gasped loudly, looking at our father in absolute shock. Even Brad seemed stunned by the cold cruelty of the arrangement. I turned my head slowly, looking directly at the man who was supposed to protect me. "So that is the truth," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You orchestrated my termination. You asked the CEO of my company to destroy my career because you wanted to punish me for being independent. You wanted to break my spirit so I would submit to your control." Marcus puffed out his chest stubbornly, refusing to back down. "It was for your own good, Maya. You needed a reality check. You were getting too arrogant. Victor did me a personal favor. He put you in your place." I turned my attention back to Victor. The former corporate titan was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow and rapid. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had sold his company to his own victim. I pulled the second document from the dossier and dropped it directly on top of the acquisition contract. It was a formal termination notice printed on heavy stock paper with the Apex Global Consortium letterhead. I looked at Sterling, my gaze piercing right through his crumbling facade. You fired me as a favor to my father. Now I am firing you for gross corporate misconduct. The building security team is clearing your desk right now. Sterling turns completely pale, his former arrogance evaporating instantly into pure, unfiltered dread. The suffocating silence that gripped the dining room shattered the moment Brad slammed his hands onto the mahogany table. He launched himself out of his chair, sending it crashing backward onto the imported rug. His face was a mask of panicked fury. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, a vein bulging dangerously against his tailored collar. "This is absolute lunacy!" Brad screamed, his voice cracking under the pressure of his collapsing reality. "You are completely out of your mind, Maya. You are nothing but a bitter, vindictive liar trying to sabotage this evening because you are jealous of Chloe. You fabricated this ridiculous corporate fantasy to ruin our family image." "Father, please do not listen to this insane woman. She is just a disgruntled employee throwing a temper tantrum." I did not raise my voice. I simply shifted my gaze from the broken former executive beside me and locked my eyes onto Brad. He was practically vibrating with terror, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to maintain the illusion of his success. He looked toward my parents, demanding they intervene. "Marcus, do something," Brad yelled. "Throw her out of this house before she embarrasses you further. Diane, tell them she has a history of mental instability. Do something right now." My parents remained paralyzed. Diane was shaking uncontrollably, tears ruining her expensive makeup, but no words escaped her mouth. Marcus stared blankly at the wall, his wealthy patriarch facade entirely stripped away. They knew they had no power here. They were trapped in the wreckage of their own making. I stepped away from Sterling and walked slowly down the length of the dining table toward Arthur and Eleanor. The older couple watched me with cautious, calculating eyes. They were ruthless business people who recognized a genuine threat when they saw one. Arthur did not look at his panicking son. He kept his sharp, intelligent gaze fixed entirely on me. I reached into the thick manila envelope resting on my silver serving tray. I pulled out a second heavily bound document. This one was marked with bright red forensic accounting tabs and a highly confidential security seal. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood echoed like a gavel. "I am not here to ruin an image, Brad," I stated calmly. "I am here to correct the historical record." I placed my fingertips against the edge of the thick document and slid it forcefully across the polished mahogany table. The heavy report glided smoothly over the wood, stopping perfectly square in front of Arthur Sterling. Brad let out a strangled gasp and lunged across the table to grab the file. He knocked over a crystal water glass, sending ice spilling across the expensive linen. Before his grasping fingers could reach the paper, Arthur slammed his heavy hand down on top of the document. Arthur glared up at his son with an expression of freezing disgust. The unspoken command was clear. Brad slowly pulled his hand back, shrinking away from his father. Arthur flipped open the heavy cover of the forensic report. His eyes immediately began scanning the highlighted transaction logs and the verified bank routing numbers. "Your son loves to brag about his asset allocation strategy," I said, addressing Arthur and Eleanor directly. "He loves to boast about the unprecedented returns he generated for your top-tier elite clients. He told you he completely reorganized the portfolios to maximize profitability. He lied to you. He lied to your board, and he lied to the federal regulators." Brad's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe. "It is a mistake," he stammered, his voice dropping to a pathetic whine. "It is just an accounting error, Father. The auditors misread the offshore transfers. I can explain everything." "There is absolutely nothing to explain," I countered, my voice cutting through his pathetic excuses like a surgical blade. "The forensic audit is conclusive. Brad did not generate any returns. He suffered catastrophic market losses 2 years ago due to gross negligence and unauthorized speculative trading. To hide those losses, he began moving money between shadow accounts. He created a Ponzi structure using new client capital to cover the missing funds. He embezzled exactly $1.5 million to keep the illusion afloat. Eleanor gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her throat. Arthur remained completely silent, but his face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as he turned the pages, reading the undeniable proof of his son's criminal activity. Chloe stood up, gripping the table. "You are lying, Maya," she shrieked, her voice shrill with panic. "Brad makes millions. He bought me a platinum engagement ring. He is paying for a destination wedding in Monaco. You are just making this up because you want to destroy my happiness." I turned my attention to my sister. "He is not paying for anything, Chloe," I revealed, watching the final piece of their delusion shatter. "Brad ran out of client money to steal 6 months ago. The margin calls were destroying him. He needed cash immediately to avoid a federal audit. So he came crying to your parents. He convinced them it was a temporary liquidity crisis. He needed a bridge loan and promised to pay them back once his promotion was finalized." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders shaking. Diane buried her face in her hands, letting out a ragged sob. They wanted a billionaire son-in-law so badly they sacrificed everything. I continued exposing the deepest secret in the room. They drained their retirement accounts. They mortgaged the real family home. They liquidated everything they owned and handed cash directly to Brad. This estate is a rental. The catering was paid for on credit. The silence that followed was heavy with absolute ruin. Arthur closed the forensic folder and looked up. I met his furious gaze with unwavering calm. "Your son isn't a prodigy," I stated cleanly. "He's a thief, and my parents went bankrupt covering his tracks." Arthur Sterling did not blink. His eyes remained locked onto the glowing red tabs of the forensic accounting report resting on the mahogany table. The suffocating silence in the dining room stretched until it felt physically heavy. The polished silver cutlery gleamed under the crystal chandelier, mocking the absolute destruction unfolding below it. Arthur gripped the edge of the thick document. His knuckles turned a sharp, stark white. The color rapidly climbed his neck, flushing his cheeks and creeping into his hairline until his entire face was a mask of boiling crimson rage. He slowly flipped the heavy page. He traced his index finger down a column of highlighted offshore transfers. The undeniable proof of his sons funneling millions of dollars into phantom shell corporations sat plainly before him. Arthur slowly lifted his head. He turned his terrifying gaze toward Brad. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. Brad shrank back into his plush dining chair, attempting to make himself physically smaller. Sweat poured down Brad's temples, soaking into the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. "Explain this," Arthur demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. A low, lethal rumble that carried more menace than a screaming, violent fit. "Explain to me how you managed to vaporize $1.5 million of client capital without triggering a single internal compliance alarm. Explain how you hid catastrophic market losses behind a maze of fraudulent shell companies you set up using my firm infrastructure." Brad opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His lips moved in a pathetic, silent stammer. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He wiped his trembling hand across his forehead, smearing the sweat into his perfectly styled hair. "Father, I can fix it." Brad finally choked out, his voice cracking instantly. "It was just a temporary setback. The market took an unexpected turn and I needed a bridge to cover the margin calls. I was going to replace every single cent before the quarterly audits. I swear to you I had a recovery strategy in place. You just have to give me time." "You stole from our top-tier clients," Arthur roared, slamming his fist down onto the table with such terrifying force that the crystal wine glasses violently rattled. "You used the Sterling name to execute a pathetic amateur Ponzi scheme. You jeopardized the entire reputation of my company. You committed federal crimes to cover up your own gross incompetence." Brad flinched violently, throwing his hands up as if physically shielding himself from his father's wrath. He spun around in his chair, looking desperately across the table. He locked eyes with my father. "Marcus, tell him," Brad pleaded, his voice dripping with pathetic desperation. "Tell my father about the arrangement. Tell him we had a solid plan to repay the funds. Tell him this was all just a temporary cash flow issue. We are going to be family, Marcus. You have to back me up right here today." Marcus remained rigidly frozen in his chair, his face a sickly shade of gray. The illusion of his wealthy patriarchal control had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a terrified bankrupt man desperately clinging to the wreckage of his own manufactured reality. He looked at Brad, then looked at Arthur Sterling. The billionaire patriarch was glaring at Marcus with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Arthur realized my parents were completely complicit in his son's criminal cover-up. The pressure finally broke Marcus. Instead of defending the golden boy he had mortgaged his entire life to protect, Marcus snapped. He turned his absolute fury onto me. He shoved his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the Persian rug. "You absolute traitor," Marcus screamed, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful, vindictive little traitor! How dare you bring this garbage into my dining room? How dare you expose private family business to outsiders? We handled this internally. We were protecting this family from ruin, and you just dragged us all into the mud because you are jealous of your sister. You have always been a bitter disappointment, Maya. This is unforgivable. You just destroyed everything we built." I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic screaming wash over me. "You destroyed yourselves," I replied, my voice echoing with icy calm. "You went bankrupt trying to buy a billionaire's son-in-law. You sacrificed your own financial security to cover up a felony. Do not dare project your pathetic choices onto me." Across the table, Diane began to hyperventilate. Her hands clawed desperately at her throat as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The heavy diamond necklace she wore suddenly looked like a glittering metallic noose. "Oh, my dear God," Diane gasped, her chest heaving erratically. "The country club, the wedding deposits, the society pages, everyone is going to know. We are completely ruined, Marcus. We have absolutely nothing left." She slumped forward, resting her head against the cool mahogany table, letting out ragged, panicked sobs. Chloe sat frozen beside Brad, her eyes wide with mounting horror. She stared at the platinum engagement ring on her finger, finally realizing it was a symbol of fraud rather than a ticket to elite society. Arthur ignored the pathetic breakdowns happening around him. He stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket tight. He looked down at Brad with eyes completely devoid of any paternal affection. "You are no longer my son," Arthur stated, his voice echoing with chilling finality. "You are a criminal liability. I am formally disowning you effective immediately. You will not step foot in my firm or my home ever again." Eleanor stood up. "We are leaving this pathetic circus right now." Arthur turned back. "I will not allow your choices to drag my firm into federal investigations," Arthur announced. "I am pressing federal charges against you, Brad, to save my reputation." They stormed out the massive front wooden doors, leaving the ruined family behind in absolute quiet shock. The oak doors clicked shut, echoing like a final gavel strike through the foyer. The quiet that followed was suffocating. Brad sat slumped, staring vacantly at the Persian rug. Diane remained paralyzed, her hands gripping the edges of the mahogany table, her hair a tangled mess around her tear-stained face. The golden ticket to high society had just walked out the door and taken their entire future with it. Marcus slowly turned his head. His eyes now burned with a feral intensity. He looked at me with the calculating greed of a cornered animal, realizing a new food source stood right in front of him. He straightened, adjusting his collar in an attempt to reclaim his authority. "You did this!" Marcus snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly pitch. "You drove them away with your vindictive theatrics. You ruined your sister life because you could not stand to see her happy. But you are going to fix it, Maya. You are going to fix all of it right now." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. "I'm going to fix the fact that you mortgaged your soul to cover for a federal criminal. That is not my mess to clean up, Marcus." "You owe us," Marcus shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. "You sat there hoarding millions while your own flesh and blood faced financial ruin. You let us drain our retirement accounts while you were secretly buying up companies. And I know about the real estate, Maya. Do not think you can hide that from me. My private investigator found the transaction records yesterday. You bought that massive estate in Oak Bluffs. You spent millions on a beachfront property while watching us struggle. Diane gasped, looking up with a sudden glimmer of desperate hope. Oak Bluffs, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Marcus, she has a house in Martha Vineyard. We could sell it. We could cover the debt. Marcus nodded aggressively, taking a step toward me. That is exactly right, Diane. He pointed his finger at my chest, his face red with entitlement. You are going to transfer the deed to that property over to me by tomorrow morning, Maya. I am your father. I paid for your education. I put a roof over your head. I am legally entitled to a portion of your assets. If you refuse to sign it over, I will sue you for everything you are worth. I will drag you through family court and prove you used my connections to build your holding company. I will freeze your accounts and take that house before you can even hire a defense attorney. I stared at him. The man who orchestrated my firing and abused me for years was now demanding I hand over my sanctuary. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a polite chuckle, but a loud, ringing, genuine laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The sound was so entirely out of place in the room of weeping, ruined people that Marcus actually took a step back, his face twisting with confusion and rage. You are going to sue me? I asked, wiping a tear of pure amusement from my eye. You are going to take me to family court and claim you deserve the house I bought with the software patents I developed entirely on my own. It is family property, Marcus insisted, his voice wavering slightly against my absolute confidence. I am your legal guardian in the eyes of the family trust. I have rights. You have absolutely nothing. I stated, my laughter dying instantly, leaving only cold, hard fact. I did not buy the Oak Bluffs estate under my name, Marcus. I am not stupid enough to leave an asset exposed to a family of financial parasites. The deed to the Martha Vineyard property belongs to an irrevocable trust. The legal term hit him like a physical blow. His jaw went slack. Diane let out a sharp whimper, sinking lower into her chair. An irrevocable trust, I repeated, letting the words sink deeply into his panicking brain. I established it 3 years ago. I am the sole beneficiary, but I do not technically own the asset. The trust owns the asset, which means it is completely shielded from civil litigation, personal bankruptcy, and frivolous lawsuits filed by desperate fathers. You cannot touch a single dime. You cannot place a lien on it. You cannot force a sale. No judge in the country can break an irrevocable trust for a familial dispute. It is an absolute impenetrable fortress, and you are locked outside. Marcus stared at me, his chest heaving as the last remaining exit door slammed shut in his face. The realization that I was entirely untouchable, that my wealth was protected by a legal barrier he could never breach, broke his spirit completely. He sagged against the dining table, defeated. Chloe, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally erupted. She jumped to her feet, her face stained with ruined mascara and pure childish fury. She pointed her diamond-adorned finger at me. "We do not need your stupid beach house!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "We do not need your money or your arrogant attitude, Maya. Keep your pathetic island retreat. We have our beautiful home right here in the city. We have the estate. We will figure this out without you. We do not need anything from you at all." I looked at my sister, her chest heaving with desperate pride as she clung to the final symbol of their wealth. The room was completely silent again, as they all waited for my response to her ridiculous empty threat. I slowly reached back into the thick manila envelope resting on my silver tray. I felt the smooth, crisp paper of the final document. I gripped the edge, pulling it free into the bright chandelier light, setting up the ultimate destruction of their facade. I slowly pulled the crisp, heavy parchment from the very bottom of the manila envelope, feeling the satisfying weight of the paper. The room watched my hands with morbid fascination. Chloe was still breathing heavily from her little tantrum, her hands planted firmly on her hips. She looked around the opulent dining room, admiring the vaulted ceilings, the crystal chandelier, and the imported Persian rugs, as if the sheer physical weight of the house could protect her from the financial hurricane I had just unleashed. "Your beautiful home in the city," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Chloe, that is exactly what I wanted to discuss next." Marcus stared at the document, his eyes narrowing. A fresh wave of panic washed over his face, replacing the brief moment of angry defiance he had managed to summon just seconds ago. You see, Chloe, your father has always been a man who prioritized appearances over actual substance, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. When Brad came crying to him about the missing $1.5 million, Marcus did not sit down and do the math. He did not look at the family accounts and realize they did not have the liquid cash to cover a federal crime. He simply saw an elite corporate marriage slipping through his fingers, and he panicked. I turned my gaze directly to my parents. You liquidated your retirement funds first, I stated, walking slowly around the edge of the long dining table. But that only covered a fraction of Brad's massive embezzlement deficit. You needed hundreds of thousands of dollars more in hard, untraceable cash. And you needed it fast, before the federal auditors knocked on Arthur Sterling's door. No reputable financial institution was going to approve a personal loan of that magnitude without collateral and extensive income verification. Shut your mouth, Maya. He hissed, his voice barely a whisper. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Your private banking affairs stopped being private the moment you defaulted, I countered sharply. You were completely desperate, Marcus. You went to a secondary lending institution. You took out a predatory loan with a brutal compounding interest rate. You leveraged everything you had left to secure that cash. You put up this entire historic city estate as your primary collateral. Dad, what is she talking about? Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. You own this house. He kept his terrified eyes locked onto the document in my hand. We had an arrangement with the lender. Marcus stammered, a thick layer of sweat coating his forehead. We just needed a few months for Brad's promotion to clear. We had a verbal agreement for a 60-day extension on the repayment schedule. Verbal agreements mean absolutely nothing in the world of high finance, I stated cleanly, stopping directly behind my father's chair. When you missed your third consecutive payment last month, your loan was automatically classified as distressed debt. The secondary lender realized you were completely insolvent. They realized you were never going to make another payment because your golden boy Brad had just lost his career and his father-in-law in one spectacular public implosion. Diane let out a weak, pathetic sob, burying her face in her arms. The lender did what any smart financial institution does with toxic debt. I continued, my voice ringing clearly through the silent dining room. They packaged your defaulted loan into a portfolio and sold it off to the highest bidder at a steep discount just to recoup their initial losses. They scrubbed you from their ledgers and washed their hands of your financial ruin. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, trying to muster one final shred of patriarchal authority. So what, he growled, trying to sound defiant. Some faceless debt collection agency owns the mortgage now. I will hire a bankruptcy lawyer. I will tie them up in court for years. We are not leaving this house, Maya. I leaned down, bringing my face inches from his ear. I dropped the heavy document directly onto his empty dinner plate. You are dealing with Apex Global Consortium. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him a sickly pale gray. He stared down at the document resting on his plate. It was the official notice of debt transfer. My holding company specializes in acquiring distressed high-value assets, I explained, stepping back to address the entire ruined table. When your predatory lender put your defaulted mortgage up for auction 3 days ago, my acquisitions team flagged it immediately. I saw your names printed out clearly. I saw the address of this beautiful city estate Chloe loves so much. I let out a slow, steady breath, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. For years, I had listened to your endless lectures about financial responsibility and strategic planning, while you secretly built a fragile house of cards. I watched you judge every decision I made, while you blindly threw your future into a burning pit to maintain an illusion. I authorized the purchase immediately, I revealed. I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. The transaction cleared banking regulations yesterday afternoon. Diane looked up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. What does that mean? She choked out, her voice raw and breaking. Maya, what exactly does that mean? It means I am no longer just the daughter you kicked out of this house. I stated, my voice echoing with undeniable authority. I am legally your primary creditor. I hold the exclusive deed to this property. I own the roof over your head, the floor beneath your feet, and every brick of this estate. You told me to pack my bags because failures do not belong here. You were absolutely right. I expect you all to vacate my property by tomorrow morning. Security will be arriving at 8 to ensure the transition is orderly and complete. Do not take anything that belongs to the house. The heavy stock paper felt pristine between my fingertips. I held it up, letting the harsh light of the crystal chandelier illuminate the dense legal text. The seal of the city court was stamped perfectly at the bottom corner. Marcus watched my hands with the wide, terrified eyes of a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. I did not rush. I walked around the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking against the imported hardwood floors that I now officially owned. The sound echoed through the cavernous dining room. I stopped right next to his chair. I placed the document gently onto the polished wood, right next to his empty crystal wine glass. Marcus did not move. He seemed entirely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the situation. His mind, which had spent decades calculating how to manipulate and dominate everyone around him, had finally short-circuited. He stared at the crisp white page. "Read it, Marcus," I instructed, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. "Read the very top line aloud for everyone to hear." Diane let out a suffocating gasp, her hands flying to her throat as if she were physically choking on the tension in the room. "Read it," I demanded again, striking the table with my knuckles. Marcus flinched violently. He reached out with trembling fingers. His hands shook so badly that the heavy paper audibly rattled as he lifted it closer to his face. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed him. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against his tightly buttoned collar. "Official notice to vacate," he finally choked out, his voice sounding like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. 30-day eviction notice." The words dropped into the dining room like heavy lead weights. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Diane let out a long, wretched wail. She slumped completely forward, burying her face in her arms, as the last remaining pillar of her high society fantasy collapsed into dust. Chloe sat frozen, her mouth hanging open. She looked from Marcus to me and then down to the document. "You cannot do this," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of fear and denial. "This is our house. I grew up here. You cannot just kick us out into the street. We are your family." I turned my attention to my younger sister, the golden child who had spent her entire life walking over me, treating me like a stepping stone to her elite future. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the clean, purifying cold of a debt being settled. I looked back at Marcus, meeting his terrified, broken gaze. "You told me something very important on the night you kicked me out of this house, Marcus. Do you remember your exact words?" He stared at me, his eyes pooling with tears of absolute defeat. He shook his head slowly, unable to speak. "You looked me straight in the eyes and you told me that failures do not belong in that house," I said, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "You told me that I was a liability to your perfect image and that I needed to pack my bags and disappear." I smiled, letting the coldness reach my eyes. "You were right, Marcus. Failures absolutely do not belong in that house, so I expect you, Mom Chloe, and your thief of a husband out of my property by the end of the month. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your entire pathetic existence and vacate the premises." Marcus dropped his head into his hands. His broad shoulders began to shake as he quietly sobbed. The great patriarch, the mastermind behind decades of manipulation, was reduced to a weeping, homeless man sitting at a dining table he no longer owned. Diane continued to wail, her manicured nails digging into the mahogany wood as if she could physically anchor herself to the estate. But the reality of their complete destruction was undeniable. I had not just defeated them, I had entirely erased their power. I had taken the very ground they stood on. Chloe suddenly shot up from her chair. She pushed herself away from the table, her face flushed with a hysterical, frantic energy. She grabbed her stomach, looking at me with wild, desperate eyes. "You are a monster!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. You are an absolute sociopath. How can you do this to me right now? Brad just lost his career. We have no money left. The accounts are completely frozen. How am I supposed to survive, Maya? How am I supposed to survive on the street with a baby? She gestured wildly to her midsection, revealing the pregnancy she had clearly been using to secure her position in the Sterling family empire. The ultimate anchor baby, meant to tie her to billions, was now just another mouth to feed in a bankrupt, broken household. You are throwing a pregnant woman out into the cold, she shrieked, her chest heaving. You are throwing your own niece or nephew out onto the street. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to pay for a hospital? How am I supposed to buy food? We have absolutely nothing left. I stared at her frantic, tear-streaked face. I looked at the platinum engagement ring still glittering on her finger, a hollow symbol of a fraudulent future. I tilted my head, studying her panic with detached clinical interest. My expression did not soften. The emotional blackmail that had worked on me for years had completely lost its power. I picked up my silver tray, adjusting my posture until I stood straight. "Try getting a job," I replied, my voice echoing with casual, absolute finality. "I hear Sterling's old firm is hiring entry level." The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the reality of her total destruction finally registered in Chloe's eyes. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She looked from me to the eviction notice, and finally to the man sitting paralyzed beside her. Brad had not moved a muscle since Arthur Sterling walked out the door. He was a hollow, empty shell. Chloe let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. It was a guttural, visceral noise of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward. Her manicured hands curled into claws, and she struck Brad directly across the chest. "You ruined everything!" Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing through the dining room like shattered glass. She hit him again, her fists pummeling his shoulders as he weakly raised his arms to shield his face. "You absolute pathetic loser. You said we were set for life. You told me Arthur was going to hand you the keys to the empire. You lied to me. You got caught like an amateur." Brad shrank back into his chair, trying to lean away from her frantic blows. "Chloe, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking. "I can fix this. I know people. I can make calls." Chloe slapped his hands away, her face contorted with disgust. "Make calls," she mocked hysterically. "Who are you going to call? Brad? The federal prosecutors? You are going to prison. You have no money. You have no name. I am pregnant by a felon." She grabbed his shirt, shaking him. "I am not going down with you. I am filing for divorce tomorrow. I will take everything you have left." Brad stared at her, vacant and silent. He slowly lowered his hands, offering no further defense against her manic screaming. Marcus watched his perfect societal alliance dissolve into a pathetic, violent brawl right inside his dining room. The sight of it seemed to break the final remaining gear in his calculated mind. He turned away from the fighting couple and staggered toward me. The domineering patriarch was completely gone, leaving a desperate, trembling old man. "Maya, please," Marcus begged, his voice reduced to a pathetic whisper. He held his hands up. "You have made your point. You won, Maya. You hold all the cards. But you cannot do this publicly. You cannot evict us. You cannot put us on the street." I kept my face entirely impassive. "You signed the loan and defaulted." "I simply bought the paper." Marcus took a step closer. "Maya, the church," he pleaded. "I am the head of the financial committee. The elder board looks up to me. The entire congregation respects me. If word gets out that I am bankrupt and my son-in-law is a criminal, I will be ruined. I will be a laughingstock. I need you to keep this quiet. I will sign a quiet repayment agreement. Just please, Maya, do not humiliate me in front of the congregation." I looked at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of disgust. "You used that church to parade your fake morality for decades," I replied, my voice echoing with icy calm. "You stood at the pulpit and preached about integrity while actively covering up a felony in your own dining room. Your reputation is a complete lie, Marcus, and I am not going to spend a single dime of my money to protect your fragile ego. The congregation deserves to know exactly who has been managing their financial committee. A loud thud echoed through the room. I looked past Marcus to see Diane collapsed on the floor. She had literally fallen to her knees, her designer dress pooling awkwardly around her on the Persian rug. The heavy diamond necklace she prized so much hung crookedly against her collarbone. She looked up at me, her face a smeared mask of mascara and tears. "Maya, please," Diane sobbed, reaching her shaking hands out toward my shoes. "Please do not do this to us. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just throw your own mother out into the cold." I stared down at her, watching the ultimate manipulator deploy her final desperate tactic. "Family is about forgiveness." Maya, she wept, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "We made mistakes. We were wrong. We were just trying to protect Chloe. We were just trying to keep the family together. You have to find it in your heart to forgive us. You have to remember the good times. We raised you. We loved you in our own way. Please, Maya, have some mercy. We have nowhere else to go." I did not move a single inch. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood comparing me to my sister, dismissing my achievements, and treating me like an inconvenient burden. "There were no good times, Diane." I stated, my voice perfectly flat, devoid of any emotional warmth. "You did not love me in your own way. You merely tolerated my presence until you found a way to use me. You only remembered we shared blood when you needed a scapegoat. You are only begging for forgiveness now, because you are completely out of options. Forgiveness requires genuine remorse. You are not sorry for what you did to me. You are only sorry that you finally got caught. You are sorry that you bet on the wrong daughter and lost everything." I stepped back, creating a physical distance between us. The dining room was a portrait of absolute devastation. Chloe was still screaming at Brad, who sat motionless, staring at the wall. Marcus stood frozen, his face buried in his trembling hands. Diane remained crumpled on the floor, weeping uncontrollably into the expensive rug she no longer owned. The illusion of the perfect wealthy family had been shattered, leaving behind only the ugly, pathetic truth. Two private security guards hired by Maya in advance step into the dining room. The two men standing in the archway wore perfectly tailored black suits. They were physically imposing, completely silent, and entirely unfazed by the spectacular breakdown unfolding across my dining room. I had contracted them 3 weeks ago from a premier corporate security firm with very specific instructions regarding this exact moment. I turned away from the pathetic display on the floor and nodded to the taller guard. "The party is over," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the room. "Escort them off my property right now." The taller guard stepped forward immediately. His heavy footsteps against the hardwood commanded instant attention. "It is time to leave," he stated, his tone completely devoid of any emotion. "We can do this the easy way, or we can involve local law enforcement. The choice is entirely yours." Diane gasped violently, scrambling backward on the Persian rug. She looked up at the large men in utter terror before turning her tear-streaked face toward Marcus. Marcus slowly lowered his hands. His face was a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the guards, then looked at me. The final realization that he held absolutely zero authority in this house finally registered in his hollow eyes. He did not say another word. He simply reached down and grabbed Diane by the arm, hauling her to her feet with rough urgency. Chloe, however, refused to accept reality. She stood frozen, glaring at the security team with pure aristocratic entitlement. "You cannot touch me!" Chloe shrieked, stepping backward until her back hit the mahogany wall. "I am pregnant. If you lay a single finger on me, I will have you arrested for assault. I will sue this entire security company into bankruptcy." The second guard stepped smoothly around the table, cutting off her escape route. "Mom, we are simply asking you to walk out the front door," he replied, remaining perfectly calm. "Please gather your belongings and proceed to the exit." Brad was the first one to actually move. He stood up like a mechanized drone, entirely unresponsive to his surroundings. He did not look at his furious wife or his weeping mother-in-law. He simply turned and began walking toward the foyer, his posture completely defeated. Seeing her husband surrender so easily finally broke Chloe. She let out a frustrated scream, grabbing her designer purse from the side table and storming after him. Marcus and Diane followed closely behind her, their heads bowed in absolute shame. I walked slowly behind the security team, watching my family march through the grand hallway. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light over their pathetic retreat. They passed the expensive oil paintings and the imported vases they had purchased with stolen money. They reached the massive double doors of the estate. The guards pulled the heavy oak open, letting the cool evening wind sweep into the foyer. My family stepped out onto the wide stone porch. I stood in the doorway watching them descend the grand staircase toward the circular gravel driveway. The silence of the night was suddenly broken by the loud grinding mechanical roar of a heavy diesel engine. A massive industrial tow truck was backing slowly up the long driveway, its bright orange warning lights slicing through the darkness. The reverse alarm beeped in a steady, rhythmic cadence. The truck navigated the curve and stopped directly in front of the gleaming silver Mercedes parked near the fountain. "Hey," Chloe screamed, sprinting across the gravel in her expensive heels. "What are you doing? Get away from my car! That is a brand new custom lease. If you scratch the paint, I will personally ensure you never work in this city again." The driver did not even pause. He ducked under the front bumper, attaching the heavy steel hook to the chassis. "Miss, I have a legal repossession order," he called out, pulling a clipboard from his pocket. "This vehicle belongs to the dealership. The account is 4 months in arrears." Chloe spun around, looking frantically at her father. "Dad, tell him," she demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "Tell him the payments are current. You set up the automatic transfers from the corporate account. Tell him he has the wrong vehicle." Marcus stood completely paralyzed on the stone steps. He stared at the tow truck driver with an expression of total bewilderment. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He knew the corporate accounts had been drained, but he also knew the car lease had somehow remained current until very recently. I stepped out onto the porch, leaning casually against the stone pillar. "The dealership did not make a mistake, Chloe," I announced, projecting my voice clearly over the rumbling engine of the tow truck. "Your payments were indeed current up until 3 weeks ago." Chloe whipped her head around, glaring up at me. "What did you do, Maya?" she shrieked. "I simply stopped paying for your life," I replied, crossing my arms. "When Marcus bought that car to maintain your elite social image, he could not actually afford the monthly premiums. He forced the company into a corner. To keep him off my back, I quietly set up a shell entity to cover the payments. I have been paying for your luxury vehicle for 2 years, Chloe, but the moment I discovered your husband was embezzling client funds, I permanently severed the automatic transfers. The checks bounced. The grace period expired yesterday." The hydraulic winch whined loudly, lifting the front wheels of the Mercedes off the gravel. Chloe let out a devastating wail, watching her ultimate status symbol being dragged up onto the flatbed. She sank to her knees right there in the dirt, gripping her hair in absolute despair. "You planned this!" Diane cried out, clutching Marcus' arm. "You planned every single detail to humiliate us." "I planned to survive," I corrected coldly. "You are the ones who handed me the matches to burn your empire to the ground. I just finally decided to strike them." The tow truck engine roared as the driver secured the vehicle and climbed back into the cab. He shifted gears and the heavy truck pulled away, rumbling down the long driveway and disappearing through the iron gates. The silence that returned to the estate was absolute. The 4 of them stood stranded in the middle of the dark driveway. They had no home, no money, no power, and now no transportation. Marcus looked down the long, empty road. His entire legacy had been violently stripped away, leaving him completely exposed to the cold reality of his failures. He swallowed hard, his pride completely shattered. He slowly reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands shook violently as he unlocked the screen. The man who used to command private drivers and luxury fleets now scrolled frantically through his apps. He opened the ride-sharing application and typed in the address of a cheap motel across town. He stared at the screen, his face pale with utter defeat as he pressed the button to order a cheap shared Uber. Marcus lowered his phone. The glowing screen illuminated the despair etched into his sagging features. The app confirmed a battered hybrid sedan was 10 minutes away, and they would be sharing the ride with a stranger. A crack of thunder rolled across the dark city sky, followed immediately by a freezing sheet of autumn rain. The heavy drops hit the gravel driveway with a sharp hissing sound. Within seconds, the pristine tailored suits and designer dresses my family wore were soaked. The freezing rain flattened Marcus' gray hair against his scalp, making him look frail. It caused Diane perfectly applied mascara to run down her cheeks in dark streams. Chloe shivered violently, wrapping her arms around her pregnant stomach as she huddled against Brad. He stared blankly at the wet pavement, making no effort to shield his wife from the freezing downpour. They looked like a tragic painting of fallen royalty. The sheer indignity of standing in the rain, waiting for a budget rideshare outside the estate they once ruled, was too much for Diane to bear. Her fragile mind finally fractured under the crushing weight of her sudden, inescapable poverty. She let out a guttural, desperate shriek and broke away from Marcus. Diane sprinted back up the sweeping stone staircase, slipping slightly on the wet marble steps. She threw herself against the heavy glass panels of the front double doors. Her large diamond rings clattered harshly against the thick, reinforced security panes. "Maya," she screamed, her voice muffled but still piercing through the raging storm. "Maya, please open the door. You cannot leave us out here in the freezing rain like stray animals. Please just let us stay inside the warm foyer until the car arrives." I stood motionless in the grand entryway. My arms were crossed firmly over my chest. I watched the water stream down the glass, distorting her desperate, panicked face. Her wet hands slapped frantically against the door, leaving smeared handprints on the spotless surface. I took a slow, deliberate step forward until I was mere inches from the glass. I looked directly into her frantic, bloodshot eyes, refusing to show any emotion. She pressed her face against the pane, her rapid breath fogging the cold glass. "Maya, please," Diane begged, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "I am your mother. You have to remember that. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you under this roof. You cannot treat your own flesh and blood this terrible way. I am your mother." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of absolute clarity wash over me. The violent rain lashed relentlessly against her shivering back, but I felt perfectly warm inside my home. The long years of emotional starvation, the relentless daily comparisons, the silent demands for financial bailouts, all of it crystallized into one single defining truth. I pressed my palm flat against the cool interior glass, right over where her hand rested on the outside. "You were never my mother," I stated, my voice resonating with lethal calm through the thick door. "You were Chloe, mother. You spent 22 years carefully grooming her for high society, while you actively treated me like an invisible, annoying nuisance. You only remembered my birthday when you desperately needed a sudden loan to cover your excessive secret credit card debt. You only praised my hard-earned business degree when you needed someone naive to co-sign a predatory commercial mortgage you could never actually afford. You never ever wanted a second daughter, Diane. You simply wanted a convenient insurance policy." I pulled my hand away from the glass, dropping it firmly to my side. "I was never your child." I continued, steadily stripping away the final lingering layer of her toxic delusion. "I was just the bank, and the bank is permanently closed." Diane reeled back as if she had been physically struck across the jaw. Her chin trembled violently as the harsh reality finally penetrated her thick skull. She raised her tight fists to bang on the glass again, her mouth opening wide to scream another pathetic, useless plea for mercy. I did not give her the chance to speak. I pulled out my smartphone and opened the smart home application I installed yesterday. I maintained eye contact with Diane as my thumb hovered over the control icon. I tapped the screen once. A low mechanical hum filled the grand foyer. The heavy automated blackout blinds mounted above the double doors began to descend. They moved with slow precision, unrolling like a dark theater curtain marking the end of a long tragedy. Diane's eyes widened in absolute horror. She pressed her hands frantically against the glass, watching the thick fabric slide down to cut her off from the warmth of the estate. "Maya, no!" she screamed, her voice fading as the heavy material created an impenetrable soundproof barrier. The blinds met the marble floor with a soft, definitive click. The visual feed of my ruined family was severed. I turned my back, feeling an incredible weight lift from my shoulders. The silence inside the mansion was perfectly absolute. Outside in the freezing storm, the headlights of a dented silver sedan swept across the gravel driveway. The rideshare pulled to a stop, splashing through a muddy puddle. Marcus grabbed Diane, pulling her away from the sealed doors. He dragged his weeping wife down the wet stone steps. Chloe yanked open the back door, pushing Brad inside before climbing in after him. Marcus and Diane squeezed into the cramped back seat with a confused, silent stranger. The driver hit the gas. The battered taxi accelerated down the driveway, kicking up wet gravel in its wake. The red taillights dissolved into the relentless rain, carrying them away into the dark city. They were gone. They drove into the night, stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their golden child, fraudulent future. I stood alone in my foyer. The great house belonged to me. The failures had been evicted. 6 months later, the freezing rain of that night had been replaced by the warm, golden sunlight of early spring. I sat behind my massive glass desk in the executive corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The view was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of steel and glass that represented the empire I had finally brought entirely into the light. I was no longer the hidden architect working quietly from a laptop in the shadows. I was the publicly recognized Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global Consortium. My name was printed elegantly on the frosted glass doors, and my authority was absolute. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. The silence in my office was not the suffocating tension of my parents' dining room, but the peaceful quiet of total, unquestioned success. I reached across the desk and picked up the morning edition of the Financial Times. The front page featured a prominent article detailing the spectacular collapse of Sterling Global Investments and the subsequent federal investigations. The photograph accompanying the article captured Brad perfectly. He was walking out of a federal courthouse wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, his wrists secured together in heavy steel handcuffs. His normally perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess, and his face was gaunt and pale. He had been officially indicted on 47 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate malfeasance. The trial was scheduled for late autumn, but the prosecutors had already frozen every single hidden asset he possessed. He was facing a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Arthur Sterling had made good on his promise to completely disown his son, feeding him directly to the wolves to spare his own company from further regulatory scrutiny. Brad was entirely alone. I set the newspaper down, feeling absolutely no sympathy. The consequences of their greed had rippled outward, completely destroying the fragile, toxic ecosystem my family had built. My private investigators still provided me with routine updates verifying that the threats had been permanently neutralized. Marcus and Diane were currently renting a tiny, cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the far edge of the city. The rent was incredibly cheap, but the cost to their immense pride was astronomical. They had lost the historic city estate, the country club memberships, and the luxury vehicles. But the most devastating blow to my father was the complete loss of his social standing. The embezzlement scandal had made the local evening news broadcast. The reporters had specifically highlighted Marcus and Diane's desperate attempt to cover up the stolen funds by remortgaging their home. The fallout was immediate and utterly ruthless. The elder board at their prestigious church had called an emergency meeting and formally stripped Marcus of his position on the financial committee. He was publicly asked to step down from all leadership roles. When they attended the Sunday service the following week, the congregation parted around them like the Red Sea. Nobody would make eye contact. Nobody invited them to the after-service brunches. The wealthy community they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress had completely shunned them, treating them like absolute pariahs. Diane reportedly spent her days sitting in their tiny living room, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper, mourning the absolute death of her high society illusion. They had built their entire identity on perception, and when the perception shattered, they realized they were entirely hollow inside. Chloe was perhaps experiencing the harshest reality check of them all. Following the catastrophic implosion of her marriage and her husband's federal indictment, she had officially filed for divorce. But there were no millions to divide and no massive alimony checks to claim. She was a single, expectant mother with no college degree, no professional skills, and a ruined reputation. For the first time in her 30 years of pampered existence, she was forced to actually work for a living. The golden child was currently employed at a mid-tier retail clothing store in a suburban shopping mall. She spent her days wearing a polyester uniform, standing on her feet for 8 hours a shift, folding sweaters and dealing with rude customers. The woman who had previously screamed about luxury car leases and designer maternity wear was now riding the public transit bus, checking her bank account daily to ensure she could afford basic groceries. She had reached out to my corporate email address once 3 months ago, sending a long, rambling message begging for a second chance and a small financial loan. She claimed she had finally learned her lesson and just wanted her big sister back. I did not bother replying. I simply dragged the message into the digital trash bin and permanently blocked the address. The bank was permanently closed, and I had no interest in funding her redemption arc. I had spent my entire life carrying their dead weight, and I was finally entirely free. I looked toward the framed photograph resting on my glass desk. It was a beautiful wide shot of my Oak Bluffs oceanfront estate, taken at sunrise. The waves crashed against the pristine beach, the sky painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple. It was my sanctuary, my true home, the physical manifestation of my hard work and unbreakable resilience. My desk phone suddenly chimed, breaking the quiet atmosphere. I pressed the flashing speaker button. "Good morning, Maya," my lead executive officer announced, his voice buzzing with genuine excitement. "We received the signed contracts from the European delegation. The international acquisition officially cleared the regulatory hurdles. We closed the 8-figure deal." I smiled, letting the warmth of the monumental achievement wash over me. The toxic anchors that had tried to drag me under were gone. I sat at the pinnacle of my industry, looking over a horizon that belonged entirely to me. I reached out and straightened the framed photograph of the beach house. "Let us build," I replied. The story of Maya's ultimate triumph over her manipulative family reveals a profound lesson. Your worth is never defined by the diminishing roles toxic people assign to you, and true freedom requires the courage to build your own independence. For years, Maya's parents and sister reduced her to a mere utility, a financial safety net they could exploit, while simultaneously mocking her work ethic. They were so blinded by their desperate need to project a flawless, wealthy image to the outside world that they sacrificed their own daughter and eventually their entire livelihood to protect a fraudulent golden child. Maya's journey teaches us that reacting to toxic family members with emotional pleas rarely changes their behavior. Instead, her silent resilience is what ultimately saved her. While her family wasted their energy on maintaining a fragile illusion of high society grandeur, Maya quietly built a very real, unshakable foundation for herself. She recognized that she could not change her family's inherently parasitic nature, so she focused entirely on controlling her own destiny. Her financial independence became her ultimate shield. When the moment of betrayal reached its peak, Maya did not need to scream for validation or beg for the maternal love she was always denied. She simply exercised her boundaries, stepped into her power, and closed the door on their abuse forever. This narrative reminds us that walking away from familiar toxicity is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of profound self-preservation. You do not owe your future to people who only value you for what they can extract from your hard work. If you are currently feeling drained by relationships that demand everything but offer nothing in return, take the first step today. to establish your boundaries and begin silently building your own unshakable foundation.